Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Chief Operating Officer at the Holocaust Center. A live transcript for this program is available on Zoom for anyone who would like to use it. Click Live Transcript at the bottom of the screen and click Show Subtitles. The Holocaust Center for Humanity is located in downtown Seattle, just a few blocks away from the famous Pike Place Market. The Holocaust Center sits on the traditional land of the Coast Salish peoples. We honor with gratitude the land itself and those who came before us, stewarded the land, and remain leaders and activists within our communities. You can learn more about the history of the land on which you live and the Indigenous people who lived there before you at native-land.ca. Thank you to all of our attendees for joining today's program. We love this dedicated audience, and whether this is your first program or your 50th, we are glad to have you here to learn with us. It's not everyone who wants to spend an extra hour learning and discussing tough topics. This is really a special community. Thank you. I want to start today by telling you all about a remarkable occurrence in our museum this past Sunday. On the first Sunday of each month, Peter Metzelaar, a Holocaust survivor from the Netherlands, comes to our museum in Seattle to answer questions and talk with visitors. Pete often tells visitors that as a little kid, he and his mother would hide in a small cave they had dug in the woods. They did this with the help of Klaus and Rufina Post, farmers who helped them for more than 2 years. Pete visited the Netherlands in the 1990s, and the dugout cave was still there. That's the picture you're seeing now. This past Sunday, our Holocaust Center received a phone call from the Netherlands. Sentjan, the man on the phone, explained that his family owns the piece of wooded land where Pete and his mother hid in the cave. The timing of his phone call was perfect because Pete was in the museum. We recorded the Zoom call, and here's a short clip where Sentjan from the Netherlands tells Pete how he knew Klaus and Rufina Post, the farmers who helped Pete and his mom.
Well, I was born on the farm close to Klaus and Rufina.
Oh, yes.
So my grandparents were the owners of the woods.
Okay, I see. The woods.
And they always talked about it. My father always talked about it. My father doesn't live anymore, but he always talked about it. He was very, very proud that forest was a hiding place for you and your mother.
Wow.
He was very proud of it.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it's just, I feel very moved.
Okay.
Just amazing.
Yeah.
Just amazing.
Such meetings are a reminder that these stories and this history is tangible. It's in color and it's shaping our world today. It is carried on by the children and grandchildren and individuals like Sentjan. Through these stories and connections, this history remains alive, building bridges between people and communities and challenging us to recognize the humanity in each and every person, and to build communities where we respect and honor each other. June is LGBTQ+ Pride Month. In 1969, police raided a gay bar in Greenwich Village in New York called the Stonewall Inn. The gay community and others were fed up after years of harassment, and riots broke out in New York that lasted for 3 days. This uprising was a turning point in the gay rights movement. The first Pride Parade was organized in New York in 1970 to commemorate the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. Pride parades, educational events, celebrations, and concerts take place throughout the country this month of June. These are rights that we need to continue to fight for and that we need to defend. Our recent history shows us how far we have come, but also the fragility of this freedom. It's my great pleasure to have with us today one of the leading scholars in the country, Dr. Jake Newsome. Dr. Jake Newsome is an award-winning scholar of German and American LGBTQ+ history, whose research and resources educate global audiences. His forthcoming book, Pink Triangle Legacies, Coming Out in the Shadow of the Holocaust, which will be available this September, chronicles the ongoing struggle for the acknowledgement and memorialization of the Nazis' LGBTQ+ victims. It also traces the transformation of the Pink Triangle from a concentration camp badge in Nazi Germany into a symbol of queer activism, pride, and community beginning in the 1970s. In addition to serving as a historical advisor for film projects, podcasts, and plays, Jake Newsome has been invited by the French, UK, and US governments to speak about the important lessons that LGBTQ+ history has for all of us today. He now works as a museum professional in Washington, DC. And for those of you joining this program today, you will receive a special discount code at the end of the program to purchase the new book, Pink Triangle Legacies. Thank you so much, Dr. Jake Newsome, for joining us today from Washington, DC. I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good early evening, depending on where you're watching from. It's great to be here in this digital space with all of you to talk about this important chapter of history. So I thank you, Ilana, for that introduction. That was a really moving story of the survivor who was able to, serendipitously talk with this family from the Netherlands via Zoom. What a world we live in, that can happen. Again, I just want to thank Ilana and the Holocaust Center for the invitation to speak with all of you today, as well as all of the community and co-sponsors. This really is an honor to be able to share these stories with you, and then at the end be able to have a moment of Q&A and discussion around these timely topics. So for me, both as a gay man and as a scholar of the Holocaust, I see Pride Month and Holocaust education as having really parallel missions, right? Both the projects of Pride and LGBTQ history, as well as Holocaust education, seek to acknowledge and preserve a past that is often difficult and traumatic, but at the same time, they seek to digest this history, right, in the hopes of being able to confront hatred today and promote the rights and dignity of all people in society today. So what I would like to do is share some stories with you, as Ilana mentioned, from my upcoming book. Here you see on the screen, Pink Triangle Legacies. This is a research project that I've been working on really for the better part of the past decade, that explores the ways that not only what happened to the LGBTQ community during the Holocaust, but the ways that society remembered, or as more often was the case, did not remember their suffering after the Holocaust. Now, before we look at the post-Holocaust period, I would like to start this afternoon with the story of a man named Richard Gruna, who you can see here on your screen. Richard was born in 1903 in a small coastal town in northern Germany. He had a relatively comfortable middle-class life. He was one of 8 children, so he had a big, large family. And he, from an early age, knew that he wanted to be an artist. And so he went to vocational school to learn his trade as an artist. But he also knew from early on that he was gay, and that living in his small conservative town, it was quite impossible for him to live openly as a gay man. So in the late 1920s, he decided that after he finished his schooling, would move to the capital city of Berlin, because at that time, this is after Germany lost in World War I. The German emperor abdicated the throne, and Germany's first democratic form of government, which was called the Weimar Republic, was installed in Germany. So this began in 1918. And during this time, at least in the largest urban centers of Germany, like Berlin, Munich, Frankfurt, Cologne, and Hanover, LGBTQ folks really carved out a level of, if not full acceptance, at least it was a level of unprecedented tolerance in these large urban centers. And so there were, any number of everything from nightclubs and bars to cafes, shops, restaurants that catered either exclusively to an LGBTQ clientele, or at least made it known that it was a safe space for them. But during this period, LGBTQ folks also began political organizing. The very first LGBTQ rights organization in the world was founded during this time. And there was quite a vast and dynamic gay press with a combined readership of over 1 million people in Germany at this time. So this was quite a dynamic culture. And so this is what drew artist Richard Gruna to Berlin. Now, I don't want to overemphasize the situation for gay folks at this time, because there still existed anti-gay sentiment, but also anti-gay, anti-LGBT legislation. There was, since Germany was united in 1871, there was a series of laws that governed Germans' behavior based on essentially more conservative Christian values of what they were, Christian traditional morals, rather. One of those was called paragraph 175, which was Germany's national and quite notorious anti-gay law. So here you can see on the screen, it criminalized unnatural indecency between men or between men and beasts. And I do want to mention that in this case, the word men is not kind of the generic mankind. It specifically only applied to men, and we'll talk a little bit about why in just a moment. Berlin, during the Weimar Republic, had begun relaxing its enforcement of paragraph 175, but throughout the rest of the country, especially in the countryside, local law enforcement were ramping up their enforcement of paragraph 175. So despite the Weimar Republic's reputation for being open and liberal, the average number of arrests across the nation actually rose during the Weimar Republic. There were not specific laws comparable to paragraph 175 for gay men. There weren't similar laws against lesbians or against bisexual or transgender people, other members of the LGBTQ community. But the Nazis and the Germans used a web of other laws, whether it was vagrancy, laws against public indecency, which were just kind of vague, to police the other members of the LGBTQ community. Now, the Nazis, when they came to power in early 1933, they made their stances against what they called the homosexual lifestyle quite clear and well known. They believed that people were not born gay, and instead being gay or being LGBTQ was a life choice that people made, and therefore essentially people could be forced to stop making those decisions, stop living in that lifestyle. So they believed that the original wording of paragraph 175 was too constricting. And so in 1935, they amended the version of the law to the version that you see here, which purposefully left the definition of the word indecency very vague, right? So this meant that the Nazi state now had essentially unprecedented legal authority to apply this law against so-called indecency whenever and wherever it liked. So one of the reasons that the Nazis viewed the so-called homosexual lifestyle as such a danger to Nazi Germany is, if you remember from any other learnings about the Holocaust, the Nazis were preoccupied with creating what they called the so-called master race. And so they believed that folks who engaged in same-sex behavior were essentially robbing the fatherland of future children. They also believed that engaging in the LGBTQ lifestyle supposedly inverted the natural gender orders. So it supposedly made men effeminate and weak, while at the same time turning women too masculine and too assertive, and therefore forsaking their motherly duties in the traditional gender norms. So this was the Nazis essentially saw the LGBTQ, again, I use the word lifestyle in quotes, as a threat not only to the political regime, but to the racial procreation of the German people. But as I said, the Nazis didn't believe that people were born gay. They believed there was a set of behaviors. And so the Nazis' policies did not aim to kill every single LGBT person in their territory. But that's, again, simply because they didn't believe that people were born that way. But they did intend to create a master race that was free of LGBT influences. And so what their policies, even though the policies weren't ones that evolved into genocide like those against the Jews and the Roma and Sinti, the Nazis did seek to very violently and permanently eradicate queer spaces, queer cultures, in that attempt to stop queer behavior. But at the same time, I think we really need to keep front and center that it was queer people, right, who bore the brunt of that violence. Now, civilian denunciations by neighbors, by co-workers, by landlords, so-called ordinary people, played a vital role in the Nazis' abilities to find and persecute queer people. And so here's Richard Gruna, the story we started with. Richard Gruna, he had moved to Berlin in February of 1933, which, if you know the timeline, this was literally just weeks after Hitler had been appointed Chancellor of Germany. And because the Nazis were trying to close all of these public queer spaces, there weren't places for gay people to congregate anymore. And so Richard, he was lucky, he had an apartment, and he hosted a series of parties in the fall of 1934 for all of his gay and lesbian friends. But unfortunately for him, one of the attendees of those parties spent the duration of the event noting down the names and the addresses and professions of all of the men in attendance. And we don't know anything about her motivations, but she went to the Gestapo and turned in a long list of gay men. And later that year, Richard Gruna, along with 70 other men, were arrested from this one single denunciation. And Richard ended up spending the rest of the Nazi regime in different prisons and concentration camps. Unfortunately, this was not a limited instance. The records show that about 1/3 of all convictions under paragraph 175 that made it through the courts and turned into convictions were the result of civilian denunciations. So over the course of the Nazi reign, they arrested over 100,000 gay men under paragraph 175, or I guess I'll pause and say they arrested 100,000 queer men under the law. They tended to lump together gay men, bisexual men, as well as transgender women under the label homosexual, where they didn't believe that transgender identities were legitimate, so trans women were treated as homosexual men. Over half of those who were arrested were ultimately convicted, and about 7,000 to 10,000 of so-called repeat offenders, folks who were arrested more than once, were sent to concentration camps. Although Richard Gruna was only arrested once, he was sent to a concentration camp because he was seen as a particular threat to the public, because he had hosted parties that so-called or allegedly tempted so many otherwise normal men into the lifestyle of indecency. Now, when prisoners were brought into the concentration camps, they were labeled with a colored badge that denoted why they were being imprisoned. So you can see here, there are different colors related to different so-called crimes, and those who were imprisoned for being gay were labeled with the pink triangle. So here you can see the admittance card for Richard Gruna. As I said, he spent ultimately about a decade in different prisons and concentration camps, and this is his admittance card to the Flossenburg concentration camp. And you can see up in the top right corner, he was prisoner number 2553, and you can see paragraph 175 there typed as the reason for arrest. During the chaos that was created by the liberation of Flossenburg in the spring of 1945, Richard was able to escape and make it back to his home where he reunited with his sister. Richard, in this case, was incredibly lucky because we know, or statistics show that about 60 to 65% of all pink triangle prisoners were killed in the concentration camps throughout the Nazi regime. Now, in May of 1945, the Allies were tasked or faced with the task of what to do with the hundreds of thousands of concentration camp survivors who were now in their care. And they gave the order to release all prisoners who were imprisoned for on the basis of race, politics, or religion. But the order was given those who were so-called common criminals were to be kept in prison. And since gay men, or the men with the pink triangle, had broken a national law, paragraph 175, the Allies considered them to be criminals, and any gay concentration camp survivor who still had time left on their sentence was transferred from a liberated concentration camp to a local prison where they were forced to serve out the rest of their term. That is why in a few years after the war, Pierre Ciel, who was a Frenchman who was imprisoned for being gay in a concentration camp, stated quite powerfully that liberation was only for others. Now, after the war, gay survivors sought recognition as victims of Nazism, and they also sought financial and legal assistance to be able to rebuild their lives. Here you can see a letter from a man named Bruno Bouchard, who was 45 years old at the end of the war. He had been arrested in 1939 under paragraph 175. He was never sent to a concentration camp, but he did spend 6 years in prison. Now, after the war, in 1946, he applied to have his suffering recognized and to become a member of an organization called the Victims of Fascism. Not only did this organization deny him because they saw that he had been essentially a gay prisoner, they decided to go even one step further and get the local police involved. So they notified the local police that that Bruno was attempting to so-called fraud the organization and cheat them out of money, even though he was not part of a true, so-called true victim of the Nazi regime. Now, Bruno left a very rare, an incredibly rare paper trail in the archives because he appealed this decision over and over and over again. And this is just one document of many that I was able to find in the archives. He consistently insisted that his actions, the reason he was arrested under paragraph 175, would not have been illegal under the original version of the law, that it was only because the Nazis had amended it that he was arrested. Again, the organization denied his request, and which is when he wrote this letter that you see here, where he lays out his case again and underlines a quite moving passage in the letter where he says, if all of this is not essentially powerful enough for you, I want to mention that the Nazis forced him to undergo castration while he was in prison, and that something like this could only happen under fascism. Unfortunately, but perhaps not surprisingly, his application was denied again, and this organization actually shared his name and his story as widely as possible, and he was fired. He was kicked out of his political party, and ultimately spent the rest of his life in poverty. So a lot of times, the LGBT community is considered one of the Nazis' so-called forgotten victims of, of the Holocaust, and I think that, unfortunately, Bruno Bouchard's story is just one of countless stories that really show that no one after the war forgot about the Nazis' gay victims. They were quite aware that they were victimized, but they were told yet and yet again, or rather, these organizations told gay survivors yet and yet again that they were not survivors, that they were not, or rather, they were not victims, but were instead criminal perpetrators who essentially got what they deserved. Now, in 1949, when both East and West Germany were created, both countries kept the specifically Nazi version of paragraph 175 in their criminal code. As you might imagine, there were quite a few challenges to the constitutionality of keeping a Nazi fascist law in a new democracy like West Germany. These challenges were met with dismissals by the judicial and the legal system. The fact that this law was continued into West Germany made it very difficult for people like Bruno Bouchard to tell their story, right? Because they would be admitting to acts that were still considered illegal and punishable under the same version of the law in West Germany. But in 1957, the West German High Court settled the dispute once and for all when they said that West Germany would keep the Nazi version of 175 because it was, quote, still necessary to protect the moral fortitude of the German people. And so they not only kept the version of the law, but they enforced it with vigor. You saw the graph of the annual convictions of paragraph 175 throughout the Nazi regime. If you expanded that graph to include the first 2 decades of West Germany, this is what it would look like. Right? So you see a clear, the number goes down during the war and after the war, but once West Germany is established in 1949, the numbers go right back up. So in total, West Germany arrested about 100,000 queer men. And again, they continued the focus of arresting only men and not criminalizing being essentially not, the law did not apply to lesbians or other members of the LGBTQ community. And the enforcement of this law, of course, not only came with steep fines and prison time, but also had other devastating consequences, like anyone who was arrested under the law could have their identification taken away, their educational degrees stripped away from them. They could be evicted from their housing, fired from their job, and of course then face the social taboo and the social ostracization as well. Now in 1969, the law was finally amended. It was not fully taken off the books, but it was at least amended, which cleared the way now for the emergence of a gay liberation movement. Essentially, the law said it was legal to be gay over the age of 21, which we can talk about that more in the Q&A if you'd like. But the amendment of the law in '69 did clear the way for the emergence of a gay liberation movement. Now, in the early moments of the gay liberation movement in Germany in the early 1970s, gay activists wanted to mobilize all the queer people across the nation into political action. And this is a moment where the act of coming out, right, the act of publicly or claiming your identity as an LGBTQ person, this was not just seen as a personal action, but rather a political act as well. And so it was seen as a first step that you had to kind of personally liberate yourself from the closet, but then also it was seen as the first necessary step in addressing the societal oppression of LGBTQ folks more broadly. So there was a group of activists in West Germany. You can see a couple of pictures here that were known as the Tunten. which just translates in English as to something maybe like fairies or queens. And so they were very purposefully played with gender norms, right? They were gender nonconforming. A lot of times they were gay men, but they sometimes took female names or called each other female names. They might have dressed in partially masculine and partially feminine clothing as a way to confront the prevailing gender norms of the time. So the Tunten said, well, it's quite visible to the rest of West German society that we are queer, right? That we are, the term at the time would have been homosexual. But what about all of the folks who could pass as straight? We really need to find a way to make sure that they are publicly visible as well. So the Tunten decided that it should, the strategy should be that the West German gay movement should adopt a gay symbol. And of course, that raised questions about what would a gay symbol be? What does that look like? How do you symbolize being gay? In 1972, a small short book by a pseudonym, guy under the pseudonym named Heinz Hager was published. It was called The Men with the Pink Triangle. And this was the very first account of a gay concentration camp survivor that had ever been published. And so suddenly the gay movement in Germany had its answer. They knew that the Pink Triangle was going to be perfect to symbolize the new gay rights movement that was emerging. So that same year, so again, 1972, a leftist gay organization in Frankfurt called Rot Schwul, led by the activist Martin Donnecker, wore the pink triangle as a symbol of gay activism for the very first time. Now, other gay activists and organizations in West Germany followed suit. One of those was the Homosexuelle Aktion West Berlin, which ultimately became the largest, most influential gay rights group in West Germany. They sought to reclaim, again, this pink triangle. It wasn't just a matter of identifying in the present as gay, but they wanted a symbol that harkened back to the past. And so for them, the pink triangle was a perfect symbol. And you can see here from this quote from one of the founding members of the HAW, that they were very conscious about that this originated as a negative symbol, right? It was a symbol of death and of shame, but by claiming it, they wanted to transform it into a marker of identity, of visibility, and resistance. So in a way, it was trying to rob homophobia of its power and say, this symbol used to be used against us, but it can no longer be used against us because we're claiming it as our own. So Peter Hedenstrom, who you can see here, was a founding member of the HAW, and I was able to speak with him. He was there at the moment where the HAW voted on the pink triangle, and he said that it was really perfect as a symbol because essentially Germans would recognize it as a concentration camp badge. So therefore it was explicitly historical. It would act as a warning of what happened in Germany just a few decades prior, when not only anti-Semitism and racism, but also homophobia went unchecked. And Peter said that it posed quite a direct question to anyone who saw it on the streets, and that was, had Germany adequately confronted its own Nazi demons? So very soon afterwards, the pink triangle became widespread all across West Germany. Here you can see a photo of the HAW doing one of its actions there in West Berlin. But really the pink triangle represented a break with past activism. Whereas previous generations of gay activists in the 50s and the 60s, they really promoted the idea of a right to privacy, right? They said that they should have the right to be homosexual, to be gay, as long in their private lives. So essentially what they were doing was establishing this metaphorical closet as a safe space, that as long as they remained in the closet, the government should not have any right to interfere with their lives or persecute them. What the pink triangle did, on the other hand, was essentially seek to tear the closet off of its hinges, right? These folks, like Peter Hedenstrom, who and like the folks that you see here, by using the pink triangle and the history that it represented, claimed that citizens living in a democracy had every right to claim an identity, whether that was straight or gay or any part of the queer community. They had the right to claim it not only for themselves and in private, but also publicly and openly without fear of repercussions. Now, this all started in West Germany, but it didn't stay there for very long. Here you see a picture of a guy named Jim Steakley. This represents one of those very rare moments where historians folks like myself were able to pinpoint the moment that information or knowledge was transferred between a national context. It turns out that Jim Steakley was an American graduate student who happened to be in West Berlin in early 1971 and 1972. And he attended the meetings of the HAW where they voted to adopt the pink triangle. So when he returned back to America, he was writing his dissertation, which was on German literature, but he wanted to be able to provide some German historical background for the literature. And he ended up writing a series of articles on German history, of which he wrote one of those chapters, or one article in the series on, you can see here, homosexuals in the Third Reich. And this was really the first time that the history of the pink triangle and the history that it represented, right, the persecution of the queer community, was made available in English. Only a few months after this article appeared, a group of activists in New York City, under the leadership of David Thorstad and John Lauritsen in the Gay Activist Alliance, decided to take up the pink triangle as a symbol of gay activism. And so again, it was in August of 1974 in New York City that the pink triangle was used in gay activism for the very first time in the United States. Now from there, it spread across the country. Some of you might be familiar with the quite, I guess, infamous debate about gay rights in Miami and Dade County, Florida, involving Anita Bryant. So the pink triangle, you can even see a picture of it here on the right, of course, in black and white, was used by the gay community in their fight against Anita Bryant, who made it her, I guess, her goal in life that she was going to fight against gay rights. You can see from the pictures behind her that she positioned the queer community as being dangerous to the youth. So even in 1977, the pink triangle was used as a weapon against people like Anita Bryant, but also at the same time it was used to build bridges. So even in the same political fight in Miami, there were people writing op-eds and making flyers that the pink triangle should be used to build solidarity between the gay and Jewish communities, since both had been persecuted during the Nazi regime, but also both continued to face discrimination in the present as well. Unfortunately, Anita Bryant won that battle and went on to wage a national campaign against LGBTQ rights, which also got attention in the German gay press, which I'll just leave this picture up just for a moment. I found in the archives to show you how the Germans portrayed Anita Bryant. Now, at the same time, just as the Germans did, American gay activists also saw the pink triangle as an effort to transform an incredibly dark and dangerous history into something that could unify and rally the contemporary LGBTQ community. And so here I'll show you a quote from Martha Shelley, who was a pioneering lesbian feminist activist and co-founder of the Gay Liberation Front, talking about what the pink triangle meant to her. In her characteristic grit, said that it was not only about transforming and reclaiming a symbol, but it was also a way of giving the middle finger to the Nazis. Now, by the mid-1980s, the pink triangle had become the most recognizable symbol of gay activism here in the United States and all across the world. In 1986, six activist artists in New York City designed what is now the iconic "Silence Equals Death" poster. The idea, right, was that during the context of the AIDS crisis, remaining silent about the need for aid, for help, would only lead to more death. At the time, the US government was also silent on the epidemic, which was leading again to more death. So this poster was plastered across New York City in early of 1987. And when a group that is now known as ACT UP adopted the poster, it really catapulted the pink triangle into the public consciousness in a way that it hadn't been in the previous decade. And even after ACT UP adopted the logo, it became a symbol of AIDS activism all across the world. Now, the pink triangle was always had been and remains today more than just a political emblem, right? It meant more than just politics to people. It was quite personal. So, for example, for Leslie Newman, who was a fiction author and who is both lesbian and Jewish, she remembered that as she was growing up and going through the process of coming out, she chose to publicly out herself, and she did so by wearing the pink triangle. And she speaks quite eloquently and writes eloquently about how deeply personal that choice was, especially given her dual identities as both lesbian and Jewish. The pink triangle was important to people of various backgrounds. Here you see a sign of the Triangolo Rosa, which was a Latino gay organization in Washington, D.C. in the early 1990s. The founder of the Triangolo Rosa said that we did, the men in the organization did a lot of learning from each other about the different ways to be both gay and Latino. But, quote, the Triangolo Rosa is what brought us all together. So here you can see a picture of Jose Gutierrez, who was the founder of that organization, who talks about the power of the history behind the pink triangle. And I just think that it's just quite a moving, his take on why he, as a non-Jewish Latino gay man, had no kind of connection with the history of the Holocaust, found such resonance in this particular history and in this particular symbol. So here you see Cheryl Head, who identifies as a Black and queer writer, friend, activist, and mother. She recalled the first time that she remembered seeing the pink triangle, or at least the pink triangle in activism, was through one of the ACT UP posters. But she said that it would not have been as powerful or meant as much to her if she had not learned about the history behind the pink triangle when she had visited Yad Vashem in the early 1980s. And so again, you see this point that the history behind the symbol is what gave it much of its power. Here you see Nancy Nangeroni, who is just not only a lovely person, but a incredible trans activist. She saw in the pink triangle an opportunity to build bridges. She said that having lived kind of in both communities, she saw that the transgender community, this is in the early 90s, had problems with homophobia within the community, at the same time that there was transphobia in the gay community. And so what she did was design this pink triangle that had the transgender symbol in the middle of it, right? That combines the symbols of the two genders. She distributed them at conferences, sold them at pride parades, again, as a way to try to build the bridges between the gay community and the trans community. Now, of course, not everyone agreed that the pink triangles should be reclaimed. There was resistance both in West Germany and in the United States, because some folks felt that on the one hand, they felt that you couldn't compare the discrimination that gay folks faced in the present with the extreme death of the concentration camps. And some began to argue that the pink triangle was too focused on white cisgender gay men. So I did want to acknowledge that there was some pushback to using the pink triangle, but by that point, especially by the 80s, people from all different backgrounds and experiences had reclaimed this triangle and made it their own. So it might have meant something to one person and something completely different to another community. I wanted to include this quote by Mark Siegel, who was a gay activist who was actually present at the Stonewall uprising that Ilana mentioned at the beginning of the program. He talked about the importance of the pink triangle for him as an emblem of his dual identity as both gay and Jewish. He talked about the importance of how the pink triangle, this tying the gay symbol to the history, helped give roots, historical roots and legitimacy to a gay identity that had been emerging through gay activism in the 1970s. And so really it was during the 70s and the 80s that others too saw the importance of reclaiming and writing that history. So there have been a handful of mostly queer scholars themselves who have sought to get into the archives and write this history and reclaim it so that it couldn't be silenced any longer. Of course, the history books are not the only way that we make sense of the past. The gay community has produced a number of different fictional accounts, including probably most people are familiar with the play Bent by Martin Sherman that shows the story of two gay prisoners and concentration camp prisoners in Nazi Germany. And so again, this is just all a way for the gay community to explore its past and try to set down historical roots for an identity that had been denied for so long. Of course, part of preserving the past is building memorials. And so it took a long time for folks to create memorials to the Nazis' gay victims. It really didn't kind of get traction until the mid-1980s. But as of now, there are about 22 memorials to the Nazis' LGBTQ victims in over 9 countries across the world. The discussions around whether or not to build memorials also opened up conversations about compensation of the Nazis' gay victims, especially in Germany, which would have been responsible for compensation. And in 2002, the unified German government did finally apologize and acknowledge the Nazis' persecution of the gay community, which technically made gay survivors eligible for compensation. But as far as I know, at that point, probably because most were no longer alive, no one came forward to claim that compensation. So to my knowledge, today, not a single gay survivor has received a penny of official compensation from the German government as victims of Nazism. So as I wrap up here, I wanted to tell one last story of Patrick and Hussein Carney, who you can see pictured here. Ever since 1996, and they live in San Francisco. They and a group of volunteers have put together this, it's about 1 acre large, this pink triangle on the top of Twin Peaks, overlooking San Francisco for the annual Pride Parade. They do so as a way to remind the folks who are celebrating the progress down below in the parade that we always must recognize where we've come from and the troubles of the past. And so in the picture on the left, you can see actually the pink triangle, but in front of it is the rainbow flag. And that's where I want to take us now, because probably if you ask folks today what the symbol of the LGBTQ community is, they would tell you not the pink triangle, they would tell you the rainbow flag. The very first rainbow flag was created in 1978 by a San Francisco-based artist named Gilbert Baker. He said he wanted to replace the pink triangle, and he wanted something that was colorful, something that was lively, and something with soul. So what he created was the rainbow flag. It's meant to take gay identity out of a victim status, make it more positive and uplifting. And really, since the 70s, especially by the 1990s, the rainbow flag had kind of come to become the dominant symbol of the LGBTQ community. At the same time, the pink triangle began losing its connection to the history as folks, were focusing more on the rainbow flag. The history of the pink triangle began to be largely forgotten, and so it ended up appearing just in pop culture, like in music videos, in marketing. Here you can see an advertisement for a pink triangle beer. This was from the early 1990s, and so again, it had lost the power of its connection to the history. So as I wrap up, I just want to say that the history of the pink triangle teaches us many things. First, it shows us how symbols can be embodied with multiple meanings that take on a life of their own in new contexts. It originated as a mark of shame, a badge that damned its wearer to a life of terror and torture. And immediately after the Holocaust, West German judges and politicians and scholars and even the public continued to treat the pink triangle as a badge of shame. They actively silenced the voices of gay survivors and kept their stories out of the history books. And as we saw, this silencing of history can have devastating and even deadly consequences. And yet it was through 6 decades of advocacy and activism, the LGBTQ community in Germany and then the world broke this imposed silence. They transformed the symbol of oppression into one of liberation and pride. And when they wore the pink triangle, they didn't only come out themselves, they outed a social movement and a chapter of Holocaust history. So in short, the pink triangle came to help individuals and entire communities make sense of their place in the world and in history. I would say that perhaps the greatest legacy of the pink triangle is that it teaches us that memories have power. How we remember the past can and should make an impact on our lives today. So while gay activists and grassroots scholars and community organizers fought for equality in the present, they made a promise to those generations that had come before them that we will remember. But this history teaches us that it's not enough to simply remember. It's not enough to just tell those untold stories. To honor their past requires us to take action today and to commit ourselves to justice. Remembering must always have consequences. So thank you so much for your time. I will stop sharing my screen here. I'm going to leave some contact information up just in case you do have other questions that don't get answered today. And I also will just put this up on the screen too, that for those of you who attended today, you can use this code, which we'll also put into the chat to receive a discount on the upcoming book if you would like to read more. Now I will stop and we can answer questions.
Thank you so much, Jake. I hope everyone listening will take note of that code that is on the screen now, so that when you purchase your book, you can use it and get a discount. I have several questions for you. We'll see how much we can get through in the time we've got. And the first one here comes from Marcy, and she says, "Thank you for this presentation. I love the affirmation of taking back the power and meaning of the pink triangle to one of power, pride, agency, and identity. Can you please speak further to the innovative work of Magnus Hirschfeld and how his research at the First Institute for Sexual Science influences our knowledge on gender norms and the LGBTQIA+ community today?"
Yeah, so Magnus Hirschfeld was an incredible pioneer who was really ahead of his time. He was the first to create this, it was called the Institute for Sexual Science, which housed the first LGBTQ rights organization in the world. He pioneered a campaign to have paragraph 175 repealed. He also offered gender affirmation services for the trans community. and all of this at a time in the late 1800s and early 1900s that made him really quite world famous. And folks from all over, not just Germany, but across the world, traveled to Berlin to seek his services and his counsel. Hirschfeld himself was gay and Jewish and socialist, so he was very much a target for the Nazis. And unfortunately, rather, he was out of the country on a speaking tour when the Nazis destroyed his institute. So he was able to, he was never able to go back to Germany, but he was able to escape being physically harmed by the Nazis.
Thank you, Jake. So there's another question here that comes from Lexi on Facebook, and she says, thank you. I'm researching gay and queer concentration camp inmates for a project, and I'm wondering if a large-scale survey on queer inmates of concentration camps has been completed. Is there a centralized-ish source or sources you would recommend?
And that would be incredible. And maybe somebody will one day. It is there's not a centralized database. There are organizations that can help find names of men, mostly men who are arrested under paragraph 175. I would say the best resource is well, it used to be called the International Tracing Service, but it's changed its name recently to the Arlson Archives. And you can access those archives through a couple of remote sites. I think one is the USC Shoah Foundation, another is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, DC, and where experts will help you be able to find those names. I have started a project to centralize and collect names and stories of LGBT individuals. Not all of them are necessarily concentration camp inmates, so it might not necessarily be there for your project, but you can find that at wjakenewsome/stories, and there's 7 there right now, and it will slowly grow as I have time. But unfortunately, there's not a centralized space just yet.
That's a great resource. So on that same topic then, and my last question for you is, in addition to your book, if people want to learn more and read more about gay men or other queer individuals who were affected by the Holocaust, is there a book or a film? What would you recommend?
So there is that's the thing, there's not a single book just yet. There is a really great a documentary called Paragraph 175. It's about 20 years old now, but it's still quite good and quite up to date. There are a couple of books. Again, there's one by Richard Plant called, I think it's actually just called The Pink Triangle. It's from the 80s, so again, it's a little outdated. I would say the biggest issue I have right now with the scholarship that is available is that it primarily focuses on gay men. And there is just now beginning to start to be published accounts of what happened to lesbians, to transgender people, to bi people. And I would say, I would hope in the next 2 to 3 years, there's gonna be a wave of scholarship on the rest of the LGBTQ community. I do try to include them, or I do include them in my book as well. But I also am going to drop one more link in the chat. It's on my website, wjakenewsome.com/resources, where I've tried to, where I can find stuff that is publicly available, make it accessible there to you on that one website.
Great. That's great. We'll keep an eye on that and see what else comes. And I love that these stories are also collecting on your website. I hope that there'll be much more. And of course, there's so many challenges that are faced because these survivors are no longer living, and collecting their stories there's just so many hurdles to get them now. So hopefully we'll be able to capture them in the years to come still. Jake,
Yes.
thank you so much for your tremendous research. Can we put the code back on the screen one more time for people who want to order the book? You can pre-order it. It'll be available in September, and there's the discount code there. And of course, check out Jake's website for lots of great resources and information. And thank you again, Jake, for joining us for this program today. I want to also,
Sorry, I was just going to say thank you. Thank you again for the invitation and for everyone for signing on today and for your comments and questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Yes, thank you to everyone for joining us today. This program was recorded and you'll be able to find it on our website starting tomorrow. Our next Lunch and Learn program on June 21st is part of our Powell Day of Learning and will feature a special speaker on the topic of rescue and resistance. So stay tuned for more information on that program. And a thank you to the Powell Family Foundation for supporting our Day of Learning and our next Lunch and Learn program. All of these programs are possible because of all of you attending today and on so many of the other days, and because we have such a fantastic team at the Holocaust Center. Thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who is running the technical side of today's program. Thank you also to our CEO, Dee Simon, and Lori Werschel-Cohen, Paul Regelbrug, Jessica Michaels, Julia Thompson, Morgan Romero, Amanda Davis, Devin Shirelocke, Katie Lawrence, and Allie Laps. Thank you again for joining today's program, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Lunch and Learn program on June 21st. This concludes our program for today.